Welcome to Newsday, reporting live from Singapore. I'm Karishma Vaswani. The headlines. The British Prime Minister says the Glasgow climate deal sounds the death knell for coal power, but there's anger that India and China watered down the final wording about its use.
We can lobby, we can cajole, we can encourage, but we cannot force sovereign nations to do what they do not wish to do.
China is warning its people that coal is the biggest part of the climate problem. We'll hear from Beijing why it won't act more quickly. A man has died after a car exploded outside a hospital in Liverpool. 3 men have been arrested under the UK's Terrorism Act. Queuing to get the COVID jab in Austria, as 2 million unvaccinated people are told that from now they can only leave their homes for essential reasons. Queen Elizabeth misses the Remembrance Sunday ceremony at the cenotaph for the first time in 22 years.
Live from our studio in Singapore. This is BBC News. It's Newsday.
Hello and welcome to BBC News. It's 7 in the morning here in Singapore and 11 in the evening in London, where the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has described a global accord to speed up action against climate change as truly historic and the beginning of the end of coal power. But his remarks come after the president of the COP26 climate conference, Alok Sharma, said India and China will have to justify themselves to the world's most vulnerable countries after the two nations demanded last-minute changes to the climate deal, softening commitments to reduce the use of coal. Well, let's take a quick look at what's been agreed. The deal says limiting average global temperatures to 1.5 Celsius above pre-industrial levels by the year 2100 is still attainable. Scientists have said that amount by then would avoid the worst impacts of climate change. But there's controversy over the pledge about coal, which now says its use should be phased down rather than phased out. And among other things, the deal also pledges more money for poorer countries to help them adapt. Our science editor David Shookman reports.
It was billed as a landmark moment in our relations with the planet. But did the Glasgow conference do anything to limit the rise in temperatures? The man at the centre of the talks, Alok Sharma, had to shuttle between delegations. China and India not allowing coal to be phased out, only to be phased down. The pressure really showed at one point. And the final wording on coal has left disappointment. But this evening in Downing Street, Mr. Sharma admitted how the deal was very nearly lost.
For months, people have been asking me, some few good people have been asking me, do you feel the weight of the world on your shoulders? And I can tell you there was one really tense hour where I did feel the weight of the world on my shoulders. And, you know, so many people have done so much over 2 years, the UK team internationally, and, you know, this deal was absolutely in jeopardy.
His efforts at the conference were praised by opposition parties, but they also warned there's a long way to go.
We have made some progress and we have to acknowledge that, but we also have to acknowledge that we failed in getting that target of 1.5, and we must keep that pressure on because it will be catastrophic for areas of the world and for our planet, so we've got more to do.
So what happens now? Well, by the end of next year, countries should update their climate pledges, a faster pace than before, and they are now expected to do this more often. By 2024, a package of long-term financial aid for the poorest nations should be agreed. And then by 2030, to avoid the worst of global warming, carbon emissions should be halved. But we're still a long way from achieving that. So as things stand, the polar ice will melt faster than ever, raising sea levels and together with heavier rain, threatening millions of people with flooding. The implications of failing to act soon have never been clearer. We've already warmed by 1.1 degrees Celsius since pre-industrial times, and the hope is that 1.5 will be the limit of the rise. But we're heading for at least 1.8, and that's only if every promise is kept. More realistically, we're on course for about 2.4, a really dangerous level.
The difference between 1.5 and 2.4 is really survival of millions and millions of people and species in the planet. This is what is particularly true for the islands.
But according to Camilla Bourne, a government advisor at the heart of the talks, the worst outcomes can be averted.
We have kept 1.5 alive, but on the basis of delivering on those commitments, and that will be our next task for us as the presidency, but for all the countries, and it's on us to make sure that this is real in action.
The key to that is what's happening far beyond the conference. The spectacular fall in the price of renewable forms of energy. They now make good business sense, whatever gets agreed in talks about climate change. The arguments here over the last fortnight were about words on a page, and in the end they may or may not prove important. What matters more is the signal sent by this gathering and others to come to businesses, investors, banks, all of us, that with the right pace and scale of change, it should still be possible to get the world onto a safer course. David Shukman, BBC News in Glasgow.
Well, there was a lot of focus on China, of course, at the conference. It's the world's biggest emitter of greenhouse gases. Our China correspondent, Steve McDonnell, has more on Beijing's position on the climate deal.
Well, China's decades of breakneck economic growth have at times been catastrophic for the natural environment. They've also lifted millions of people out of poverty. This dramatic change in people's living standards has been fueled by and large by coal-fired power. Now, in recent times, China has built huge wind and solar farms, but officials are still not sure when they can phase out coal, so they're wary of making pledges to do so. That said, we shouldn't be too pessimistic because the Communist Party here is already using its media to tell its people that coal is an especially big part of the problem. Beijing has also said that the world's richest countries have benefited the most from coal-fired power, so they need to give the developing world more time to catch up.
Steve McDonnell there for us in Beijing. Well, I'm joined now by Tom Woodruff in Oslo, Norway. He works on Chinese-American climate cooperation at the Asia Society Policy Institute. He's also a former Pacific climate advisor. It's great to have you on Newsday, especially at this juncture, Tom. I just want to start by asking you, you know, we've heard a lot of criticism of China and India at the COP26 about watering down the language of the ultimate deal. How fair is this, laying the blame on them?
Well, it's great to be with you. Look, it very much, I think, depends whether you take a glass half full or a glass half empty approach here. I think if you have a glass half full approach to what we saw yesterday, it's important to acknowledge that China has never in an international pact acknowledged the need to phase down fossil fuels, including coal. And that's quite significant, even if we know that that is ultimately the direction of travel that Beijing is going in. And ideally, we need them, obviously, to move much sooner than they have committed to do. The other thing that's really interesting about that as well is that, as we're already seeing in their domestic media landscape, they are able to use what happened in Glasgow to actually help them accelerate that shift and to sell that shift at home. Now, if you take a glass half empty perspective, of course, the one thing that I think really interestingly geopolitically has happened as a result of yesterday is it's really shown that China and India are isolated when it comes to the entire world's approach to coal at the moment. And that will hopefully have an impact as Beijing works through the outcome of the COP.
Yeah, Tom, both of these countries have said that it was developed nations, just playing devil's advocate here, right? That developed nations got the planet into this problem in the first place, and that they need cash, they need technology from the rich countries in the West to be able to continue to develop, also to make that transition to greener energy. Would that have helped?
Well, I mean, it's worth taking a step back and actually thinking about this bifurcation that China and India particularly put on the table. And to my mind, it's really not a relevant principle anymore for a few reasons. First of all, by the middle of this century, China is not just as they are now going to be the largest emitter, but by the middle of the century, they'll also be the largest historical emitter over time, which completely erodes the basis of that argument. Much more importantly, though, that argument has much less resonance, both given the urgency with the issue with the issue as it currently sits today, compared to obviously decades in the past. But second of all, because actually a renewables-based development pathway for China, and particularly, frankly, for India, based on their level of development at the moment, is actually a pathway for growth and prosperity. And it actually doesn't make sense to be clinging to fossil fuels if they actually want to double down on that prosperity and growth prospects in the decades to come.
Tom, we're hearing from Alok Sharma that he's called for countries, like China and India to explain themselves, asking for more transparency and accountability on those targets. Will we get that? Will we actually see that transparency in the years to come?
Well, one thing that is a really significant outcome actually in Glasgow, and look, I was part of the Paris talk 6 years ago, and in Paris it was agreed, and it's frankly the beating heart of the Paris Agreement, that every 5 years, or 6 years now in the case of COVID, countries look at what their national targets are. Now, the fact in Glasgow that they've agreed that they will, in effect, come back in 1 year's time to look at where those targets sit, given the urgency of the decade that we are now in, and that will include a lot of pressure on China, which didn't bring any new headline commitments to this summit, like other countries, including my own Australia. That means that there will be increased pressure, particularly on them to do more. Now, whether that actually results in anything is a completely different thing. But one of the things that I think is important here is that China will reflect on the pressure and stand-in that yesterday's plenary discussion leaves them with, and they will want to be seen, frankly, in the course of the next few years as continuing to be a climate leader in some ways, and that will require them to have a much faster and better posture, particularly when it comes to things like coal.
Tom Woodruff, there, Fellow of the Asia Society Policy Institute, thank you so much for joining us on Newsday. And a reminder that you can find much more about the climate conference in Glasgow on our website, including this explainer on what exactly has been agreed and what happens next. Just go to bbc.com/news and follow the links. Well, in other headlines, British police have arrested 3 men under the Terrorism Act after a taxi exploded outside a hospital in the city of Liverpool. The passenger of the vehicle was killed and the driver was wounded. Our correspondent Fiona Trott has the latest. Just a note of caution, this report contains flashing images.
Just seconds before 11 a.m, the car explosion which killed a man inside. Terrifying for onlookers, and so dangerously close to the hospital itself. A police cordon was immediately set up. Local roads were also closed. Then confirmation that a counter-terrorism investigation had been launched.
Unfortunately, I can confirm that 1 person has died and another has been taken to hospital, where he is being treated for his injuries, which thankfully are not life-threatening. So far, we understand that the car involved was a taxi, which pulled up at the hospital shortly before the explosion occurred.
And while the cordon remains in place, patients have been told to stay away.
We're reviewing our patient activity for the next 24 to 48 hours, and patients should wait to be contacted for updates about any planned appointments.
This has been a fast-moving investigation. Just hours after the news conference, it emerged the police were at this residential street in the Kensington area. And also here, just 1 mile from the Liverpool Women's Hospital. Counter-terrorism detectives say they're keeping an open mind about the cause of the explosion. Tonight, people are being told to remain calm but vigilant.
Fiona Trott reporting there. Well, still to come a bit later in the programme, in Austria, a new COVID lockdown has just come into effect. Unvaccinated people are now banned from leaving home for non-essential reasons. We'll have a report from Vienna. But first, I want to bring you this story about the United States strongly condemning Belarus, which it accuses of engineering a migration crisis on its border with Poland. Thousands of people, mostly from Iraq, Syria and Yemen, are at a makeshift camp on Belarus's border with Poland, enduring freezing conditions in the hope of crossing into the EU. Belarus denies the accusations. Our correspondent Jenny Hill has been to the Polish side of the border near the town of Hajnówka. Her report contains some images you may find distressing right from the start.
In the freezing darkness of a Polish forest, the human cost of the political deadlock. This woman is severely hypothermic and, we're told, pregnant. She'd made it across the border from Belarus. Volunteers, then border guards, found her here with her husband and 5 children. They're in police custody, she's in hospital, and 2 other men who were with them were reportedly pushed back into Belarus.
There were 5 kids among them.
Piotr, who was there and gave us the footage, is from an informal network of people who try to help those who make it across the border.
Whether you are pro-refugees or against them, I think we all deeply agree that people need some basic humanitarian help.
At the border, desperation. People trapped in the cold of a makeshift camp on the Belarusian side. Poland refuses to let them in, and today accused Belarus, backed by Russia, of preparing the people here to storm the EU border en masse. Some people have made it across the border. They're hiding in the forests along its length. Behind them, a hostile Belarusian border force. Ahead of them, a Europe where they're not really wanted. And the Polish government would prefer you not to know about them. Journalists and aid agencies are banned from getting too close to the border. But Misha lives inside the exclusion zone and helps the people he sees.
Recently I met a group of 25 people from Iraq and before 15 from Syria, some guys from Somalia, some people from Turkey, so probably around 100 or something.
We went back to the woods where the young family was found. The geopolitical standoff continues, Belarus and Russia against Poland in the west. These scattered possessions, a reminder of those caught in the middle. Jenny Hill, BBC News, Poland.
You're watching Newsday on the BBC. Still to come on the programme. Queen Elizabeth misses the Remembrance Sunday ceremony at the Cenotaph for the first time in 22 years.
The bombastic establishment outsider Donald Trump has defied the pollsters to take the keys to the Oval Office.
I feel great about the election results. I voted for him because I genuinely believe that he cares about the country.
It's keeping the candidate's name always in the public eye that counts. Success or failure depends not only on public display, but on the local campaign headquarters and the heavy routine work of their women volunteers.
Berliners from both east and west linked hands and danced around their liberated territory. And with nobody to stop them, it wasn't long before the first attempts were made to destroy the structure itself.
Yasser Arafat, who dominated the Palestinian cause for so long, has died. Palestinian Authority has declared a state of mourning.
After 17 years of discussion, the result was greeted with an outburst of joy. Women ministers who'd long felt only grudgingly accepted among the ranks of clergy suddenly felt welcome.
This is Newsday on the BBC. I'm Karishma Vaswani in Singapore. Our headlines. The British Prime Minister says the Glasgow climate deal sounds the death knell for coal power, but admits there's a lot more work to do. queuing to get the COVID jab in Austria, as 2 million unvaccinated people are told from now they can only leave their homes for essential reasons. Well, let's get more now on that story. A new lockdown that's just come into effect in Austria. It means that unvaccinated people, around 2 million of them, will only be allowed to leave home for essential reasons. The country has one of the lowest vaccination rates in Western Europe, with COVID infections rising sharply. Our Vienna correspondent Bethany Bell has more.
These are the biggest daily infection rates that Austria has had since the pandemic began. The government has said it's very worried about the strain on hospitals. Intensive care units are coming increasingly under pressure. And so now it's really upped the pressure on the unvaccinated. The Chancellor just now said that it's clear that infection rates among the unvaccinated are much higher than among the vaccinated. And it should be said that this lockdown for people who haven't been vaccinated, already in Austria, you can't go to a restaurant, you can't go to the cinema, you can't have your hair cut if you can't show a vaccination certificate or a certificate of recovery. Now, this new step means that people will be asked to stay at home except for certain essential reasons like going to work, going to buy food, or going for exercise.
Bethany Bell there for us. Well, let's take a look now at some of the other stories in the headlines today. The Women's Tennis Association has said that Chinese player Peng Shuai deserves to be heard, not censored, after she publicly accused the country's former vice premier of sexual assault. In a post on social media site Weibo, Peng said she was forced into a sexual relationship with Zhang Gaoli, who is 75. Her post was soon deleted from China's internet. The WTA says the allegations must be investigated fully, fairly, and transparently. America's FBI has admitted that hackers exploited a flaw in security systems to send thousands of fake messages from one of their email accounts. The messages warned recipients about a possible upcoming cyber attack. The agency said no personal data was compromised. Israel has approved COVID vaccinations for children between the ages of 5 and 11. The decision was taken after the U.S. Food and Drug Administration gave its approval of Pfizer's and BioNTech's vaccine for young children 2 weeks ago. The Israeli Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett, has said his youngest son would be getting a shot. The Queen has missed the annual Remembrance Day service at the Cenotaph in London for the first time in 22 years after spraining her back. Buckingham Palace said she was disappointed not to be able to attend what would have been her first public engagement for more than 3 weeks. Our royal correspondent Nicholas Witchell reports.
It was the customary cenotaph commemoration after the limitations last year caused by the pandemic. There was, though, one notable absentee. The Queen did not, as had been expected, take her place on a balcony overlooking the cenotaph. According to Buckingham Palace, she had sprained her back. She continues to rest at Windsor. The Prince of Wales led other senior members of the royal family to their places at the cenotaph in readiness for the 2-minute silence observed in Whitehall and at ceremonies around the country. After the 2-minute silence and the sounding of the last post in Whitehall by Royal Marine buglers, the Prince of Wales placed the Queen's wreath of red poppies against the Cenotaph northern face, in tribute to those from Britain and the Commonwealth who lost their lives in the world wars and more recent conflicts. Then, after the official wreath-laying, it was the return of the Veterans' March Past. The former servicemen and women denied the chance to be at the Cenotaph last year, paying their own tributes to former colleagues. The head of state had been absent, a matter of great regret, we're told, to her and to those who were on parade. Nicholas Witchell, BBC News.
Well, in other stories, Japan's former Princess Mako Komuro has arrived in the United States to start a new life with her husband, Kei Komuro. This is Mako arriving at the JFK airport in New York. The niece of Emperor Naruhito gave up her royal status in order to marry Mr. Komuro, a commoner. She flew in from Tokyo on Sunday. After a low-key wedding last month, the couple intend to live in New York, where Mr. Komuro works. Well, that's all the time that we have for you on Newsday at this hour. Thanks so much for joining us. From me and the team, do stay with BBC News.